Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the next podcast brought to you by PM Powered, your consulting company for project, program, and portfolio needs. I'm Wanda Curley, your authority on project, program, and portfolio needs. And today we're going to talk a slightly different podcast. I'm going to take a Brookings Institute study on challenges that the U.S. government has on their IT projects. And the article is called Doomed: Challenges and Solutions to Government IT Projects. I am then going to take this Brookings Institute's review and put it to the PM-powered model on project, program, and portfolio management. So let's get going. I guess I wasn't too surprised, but I was kind of brought to my senses when I saw that the U.S. government spent $75.6 billion, that's with a B, on IT projects in 2014. So yes, this is a little dated. So if they spent $75.6 billion in 2014, imagine what they're spending this year, 4 years later. So that is enough to save the world and still have $600 million to spare. Can you imagine that? If we did IT projects even better, how much we would be able to save taxpayers. Considering the increasingly important role of information technology in the relationship between government and its citizen, these investments are not outrageously large. And I agree, but we'll soon find out that they could have been done better. If performed successfully, IT investments will improve the efficiency of government agencies and facilitate the interaction between government and the public. And that's what we really want, is the government and the public to be able to talk and see each other and what they're doing better. However, government IT projects most often fail miserably. According to the Standish Group report from 2003 to 2012, only 6.4% of federal IT projects with $10 million or more in labor costs were successful. Let me repeat that. 6.4% of federal IT projects that were worth $10 million or more in labor costs were successful. We have IT projects in the government that are worth over billions of dollars, and only 6.4% are successful. That's ludicrous in my mind. Projects like healthcare.gov websites seem to be very easy to implement, yet despite their political importance, they were often over budget and off schedule. Yes, I don't know if you know that, but healthcare.gov, when it was first rolled out, had all kinds of problems. And in fact, on the day that it opened, the website crashed more than it worked. The U.S. government is not alone in mismanaging its IT projects. Countries like the UK and Australia have had their own share of failures in IT projects. So it just goes to show you how massive IT government projects are and how incredibly complex they are. So let's go and see how much is spent by the different U.S. federal agencies on IT projects. So again, this is 2014. The Department of Defense was the largest one, and it was at $31.2 billion. That's billion with a B. The Department of Health and Human Services had $9.8 billion. Department of Homeland Security had $6 billion. Department of Veterans Affairs had $3.6 billion. Department of the Treasury, $3.5 billion. Department of Transportation, $3.2 billion. Department of Justice and Department of Agriculture, 2.7 each. Department of Commerce, 1.9 billion. Again, that's B. Social Security Administration, 1.9 billion. Department of Energy, 1.5 billion. NASA, 1.5 billion. Department of State, 1.4 billion. Department of Interior, 1.1 billion, and then other federal agencies, they grouped it as 3.7 billion. And yes, I did say billion. All of these are billions. So what are some of the challenges? Well, I think it goes without saying that one of the biggest challenges is the project size. U.S. government is a massive organization, and we all know that. They're building airports, subway systems, underground highways, are mega projects that each cost tens of billions of dollars. So if we've seen that already, that 6.4 percent of projects succeed that are over $10 million. Can you imagine those that are tens of billions of dollars, how often they succeed? So the risk of failure is high. The private sector knows that very well. The market reaction to outsourcing announcements is inversely related to the size of an outsourcing contract. Public companies experience a drop in their stock price simply because the market knows that these projects are risky and likely to fail. Excuse my dogs, they are probably barking at somebody outside. The reason that government IT projects often fail is not always incompetence in management, but also the fact that government assumes all of the involved risks. So they can offset some of the risk, but for some reason they don't. And we'll get into some of those challenges later on. These necessary projects will greatly benefit both the government and the public if they're delivered upon, but as the private sector neither has a means nor the will to undertake these projects, government is left with no choice other than to bear the risk itself, despite the fact that these projects often fail. As a 2006 Defense Acquisition Performance Assessment report puts it, government's conspiracy of hope understands cost, risk, and technical readiness leading to programs that are not executable with initial estimates. So what's the next thing that is a challenge? Legacy system. The majority of the government IT systems were developed decades ago, and the new systems that are coming in most often have to interface with these legacy systems, and it's just a disaster waiting to happen. It's just like an old car. Maintaining these systems becomes more expensive as time goes on. 70% of government's IT budget is spent on maintaining legacy systems. There is still COBOL, that's Common Business Operating Language, a programming language that was developed in 1959 is still being used. Many times implementing more efficient and less expensive IT solution is not feasible simply because these new systems cannot communicate with legacy systems. So why not do away with the legacy systems? That can be done. And I often wonder why we don't do that. I think they get too complacent with keeping the legacy system because they know it works. But if it breaks, then they have a big problem. The private sector can routinely update its IT systems because they are usually smaller and hold less sensitive information. Modern IT systems are a luxury that enables the private sector to manage new IT projects over a shorter amount of time and at a lower cost. What's the next challenge? Multiple stakeholders. In the U.S. government, we have multiple stakeholders. Due to the complex and interconnected nature of the government, even small projects have multiple stakeholders across different agencies. Consider healthcare.gov. It's a simple web platform whose primary stakeholder is the Department of Health and Human Services. However, to correctly determine the eligibility for insurance subsidies, multiple agencies had to coordinate their information systems. And of course, they all have different systems with healthcare.gov. Internal Revenue Services should have provided income verification. Social Security Administration and the Department of Homeland Security had to show the verified citizenship status of the applicant. Hierarchical structures makes it very difficult to coordinate multiple government agencies with different preferences, priorities, and capabilities. Another one that I talked about last week was the joint efforts between the Department of Defense and Veterans Affairs to establish an interoperability between electronic health record systems. They both had a different healthcare electronics health records. The two government agencies failed to achieve the interoperability even after spending 4 years and $1 billion. And they're getting ready to do it again. And they're estimating that this one's going to be $4 billion, and it's already doomed to failure. Valerie C. Melvin, Director of Information Management and Technology Resource Issues at the U.S. Government Accountability Office, that is the person that looks over failures and successes, attributes this failure to a lack of coordination between the two agencies and, quote, inadequate program management and accountability. So what's the next challenge? It's lack of business incentives. IT projects in the private sector are initiated as a result of market competition. We don't have that in the government sector. Personal preferences and political considerations play a negligible role in private sector's decisions. And I think political considerations, internal political considerations play, so I would differentiate that. Obviously, it's not the political considerations of whether I'm a Democrat or a Republican or of those sorts. But there is politics to play within a government organization. But this is not the case for government's IT projects. Political considerations may play a more salient role when making a decision to start a project or prevent early termination of unsuccessful projects. Starting a project is more often important than finishing it. Officials take credit for ambitious initiatives that would take longer than their tenure. As they leave office, the project becomes someone else's problem. While the very existence of private companies may depend on the successful implementation of an IT project, government agencies will never go bankrupt or get defunded as a result of project failure. I kind of disagree with this. Governments can go bankrupt. We've seen that. Look at how, the debt that we have at the U.S. government. We can't sustain that forever. So I disagree that agencies don't go bankrupt. They do. Individuals who design and manage IT projects in private sector are closely monitored by the industry, since the success or failure of these projects determine their future career paths. Yes and no. I think we have problems we've had huge disasters within the private sector as well. And while some careers may have been polished off because of that, other careers were actually made because of disastrous projects. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but it does happen. On the other hand, the individuals in the federal government often go unnoticed, and that is true, giving them fewer personal incentives than their solutions in the private sector. Let me talk about some of the solutions that they have come up with in this report. I agree with it, but I also want to bring in the PM-powered project management model when we talk about this. So it talks about break large IT projects into smaller ones. I definitely agree with this, but the problem is the government doesn't really know how to do it. And they actually don't know how to contract with that. So I'll talk about that in a little bit. Unlike other types of projects, it is quite possible to break IT projects into smaller projects and reduce the risk associated with projects. Modern management and methodologies such as Agile. I don't agree that it has to be Agile to break it down into smaller methods. What's good about Agile is that instead of the traditional where it's sequential, this one actually brings an incremental approach, and you can actually see things happening through this incremental approach. The problem is how do you contract with that within the government? The government hasn't really found out a way to do that. The way they do their contracting for software is usually a time and material contract, and they can't really do that with Agile. It would have to be maybe a fixed price for Agile. I think that could be done, but then the risk falls more on the contractor, and the private sector doesn't want to do that. They much rather have time and materials because all the risk falls on the government agency. And that's what they're talking about. So another solution is to transfer risk. For a long time, the government was doing fixed price where all of the risk was on the contractor, not the government. Then there's time and materials where the risk is on the government itself. Cost plus kind of puts the risk on both parties. So I can see where cost plus might be a better way of going to this, but there's got to be another way. And there's some very smart contracting folks within the federal government. So I think the federal government needs to think about a different risk of putting risk on both parties. So let me talk a little bit of how it's currently done. So currently the relationship between the government and its IT vendors are through time and material contracts, which I think is wrong. The government pays the IT vendor based upon the time spent by their employees and their subcontractors' employees to perform the work. So if somebody spends 8 hours a day, it's not a good 8 hours a day. Think about your 8-hour day at work. You go to the coffee machine, you take bio breaks, you might go talk to somebody about what you're going to do for lunch. So you probably lose about 1 or 2 hours a day in your 8-hour day. You still charge the government for your full 8 hours. That is expected and it is done. Now the government expects you to work a full 8 hours, but you're not going to spend 10 hours to do an 8-hour day. It's just human nature. So in these contracts, the government bears all the risk while vendors gain access to an unlimited source of revenue for taxpayer dollars. That is why Cerner's stock price jumped by 7.2% on July 29, its highest jump in nearly 2 years after it received a $4.3 billion, that's with a B, contract to create an electronic health record systems for the Department of Defense. With these contracts, the project will almost always be over budget and off schedule as contractors have clear incentives to bill the government as much as they can. On a time and material contract, that's what you're trying to do, is bill the government as much as you can, and that is wrong. It is wrong on many fronts. It's wrong on an ethical front, but it's done all the time, and this way of operating has got to change. The article goes on to say, as I argued before, the government has no choice in signing time and material contracts since private sector cannot perform these projects. I would disagree. I think if they did it in smaller chunks, it wouldn't be as much of a burden on the contractor to take it on. What the contractor doesn't see is that if it does successfully, then they'll probably get the next chunk, even though it might be awarded. It might be the RFP, the request for proposal, may go to several different contractors. But if you already have done the initial one, you have a hands up on somebody else. However, if large projects are broken down into smaller ones, this is what I've just said, then it will become easier to sign fixed cost contracts, and the government pays contractor only the project is delivered. However, you got to be careful with this. The contractor can't assume all of the risks, because if they can go bankrupt, whereas, as they were saying, the government doesn't. So there's got to be a shared risk, even in fixed price contracts. You could do it on incentive basis. You could do cost plus, where there's a shared risk. And while we've stayed with these types of contracts for years and years and years, my mind is that there's a different type of contracting out there. We just haven't found it yet. Become more transparent. The government's efforts towards transparency should be applauded. If you go to itdashboard.gov, you can monitor the progress. However, these efforts should be continued and expanded to IT personnel across government agencies. Right now, we don't see what people are involved in these huge, giant IT programs. The federal employees who manage successful IT projects within the scheduled time and budget should be recognized and appreciated. They're not, so they don't really have an incentive except from a personal point to go ahead and do that. Attract better talent. While the federal government can never compensate its personnel as generously as private sector, it can provide unique opportunities and it can attract many brilliant minds. The unique challenges and resources present in government work lure talented developers, top executives, and successful entrepreneurs. You can't do multi-billion-dollar projects in the private sector. So how can the PM-powered triangle and its supporting parts of the model help with this? Well, there's many different ways. Remember, the triangle has finance, it has variables, and it has time. All of these are multiplied several times over on the project, on this triangle. So if you keep the variables, and there's a lot of variables involved on a IT mega project, and variables include the stakeholders, It includes the public. It includes all the different subcontractors involved. So you have all kinds of stakeholders involved in this. You have all kinds of contractors involved. And one thing I should point out that I forgot to point out before, many of these projects or programs, there is no one person in charge. There is no one program sponsor. For example, when it was going on for the e-records between the VA and the DOD, both of them were considered co-sponsors. You cannot have that. You have to have one that has the overall decision authority. And what's happening on the new coordination of the records is, again, we have the VA and we have DOD as co-sponsors, and there isn't one person, one agency accountable. And also people down at lower levels don't feel like they have the accountability to make decisions. And this is wrong. You need to have decision makings at a lower level. It can't be all done at the higher level. So that's one thing involved in this. So time many times is done based on the accounting cycle for the U.S. government. The accounting cycle for the U.S. government is done on a fiscal year. However, they're only given money on a year-to-year basis, so people don't know if in the following year they're going to even be approved again. And if we have an election in the United States, the person that is pushing the program may be no longer in government. So they may have been replaced, and now the new person that comes in may not want this project, so it may be canceled. So you always have that on top of your head. So there's got to be a way that they need to change it so that these projects are funded for the full time. Unless, of course, they go off the rails and they need to be looked at, just like any project needs to. So we're looking at that. Then we need to look at the strategic alignment of these projects. That's part of the neuroscience involved in here. We need to look at it strategically. Many times the program manager or the project manager or the portfolio manager that has been brought onto these don't have the strategic alignment that they need to get these projects and programs going. They need to have the strategic voice that is allowed to let them make the decisions that need to be made to push these along. They need to have the accountability with the program sponsors so that they can push these along. They need to have also the integrated reasoning to understand how these people think. And there's three different ways that that people think. You have the people that look at the details, and we have to have these people that are looking at the details. They need to look at the funding across the whole thing. They need to have the people that are looking at the budgeting across the whole program, because the program manager themselves don't have the time to do that. So they need to have a program office that's helping them look at all of this. So they need to have the detail-oriented people. They also need to have the people that are looking for the forest for the trees. These are the coaches or the playmakers. They should be leading the teams. They should be focusing on getting the people across the finish line and keeping them excited about these big mega projects. Then you have the people that are looking at it strategically. These are the rainmakers. They can push it along. They can get the stakeholders aligned to the same goals and needs and wants. And remember, it's not wants that we're focusing on. It's on the needs, but you've got to be able to tell the stakeholders that what they're looking at is a want, it's not a need, and be able to tell them that we can put the want in a further, a different release, not from what we need right now. We need to show successes and wins successfully. However, you need to be able to put these people into different integrated reasoning, because if you don't have a creative program or a project. So if you have a detail-oriented person and make them a team leader and help them to be a team leader, you now have somebody that thinks in the shoes, as they say, walk a mile in those shoes. You now have somebody that thinks at a detail-oriented, and also somebody that thinks from a see the forest for the trees. Now you can't just leave this person and just let them flounder. You have to be able to have the time to monitor them and bring them and mentor them, not monitor them, excuse me, mentor them and bring them up to speed to do this. And that takes a good 6 months. You also need to be able to take the strategically focused person, the rainmaker, and put them maybe into the shoes of seeing the forest for the trees. But again, you have to mentor them and help them along because they're going to see things differently. But again, if you can get these people, the integrated reasoning, into the three different categories of thinking, then you create a creative program or project. And this is what you need. You need to have people that are creative, because unless you have creativity on these projects and programs, they're doomed to failure. And that's one of the reasons. It isn't only because of the contracting. It isn't only because of the transparency. It isn't only because they don't have the talent. The talent is in the government. It's just that you have to be able to successfully be able to give these people some kudos and pats on the back, but show them on the transparencies, show the ones that are doing well. Also highlight those that are not, and do it from the Senate and the House all the way down. Show political appointees that haven't done the creativity and haven't been able to bring their projects along. We also have to create a new way of contracting within the federal government. Now, I know that means we have to change the federal acquisition regulations, and that can be done because it's done all the time. So I challenge those in contracting to come up with a very different way of contracting. Talk to the project managers and the program managers. They can help you with the creativity on how to do contracting. They can help you with how to transfer risks. That's what project managers do on a day-to-day basis. They learn how to handle risks and how to transfer it. So talk to them, create a new way of contracting, and you can be a hero within the federal government. I hope this has brought you some thoughts and different ideas on how to do project management and program management, whether you're in the federal government or in the private sector. You can use the PM-powered framework to help you do your projects differently. So this has been brought to you by PM-powered, your contracting organization for project, program, and portfolio needs. Make sure to contact them if you have thoughts on what you need to do for your organization to bring them up in their maturity in project, program, and portfolio management. I'm Wanda Curley, your authority on project, program, and portfolio management. Please follow me on PM Current. You can see me on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn. Please follow me on all of those avenues. Also on Twitter. I'm here every Monday. I hope to see you again next Monday. Have a great and blessed week.